All right, let's continue our virtual tour of Fort Necessity National Battlefield, and we're going to pick up where we left off. So we had talked about the Battle of Fort Necessity, but that wasn't the only battle that took place in this area. So a year later, Washington returned to this area with a much larger army. So I want to start out with this picture of something that should look quite familiar to you, and that is a wampum belt. Now this one has red beads, which is interesting. The red beads would be glass. So it says this reproduction war belt is similar to the kind that would have circulated throughout the Ohio country during the mid-1700s. Belts like this were passed among the Indians to announce the coming of war. This belt is original red and blue glass trade beads that are 250 to 300 years old. The shell beads seen in the white hatchet are new wampum. So these beads around the border, around the outside, are actually 250 to 300 years old, which is pretty remarkable, pretty neat thing to see, especially after we spent some time learning about wampum belts and the importance of wampum as a tool for communication. So this is one of the ways that they would communicate that war was coming. All right, so like I said, almost a year later, on June 25th, 1755, the largest army assembled in North America up to that time passed this spot. British Major General Edward Braddock led the first 1,400 soldiers of his 2,400-man army along a 12-foot wide road. Now think back to Fort Necessity. Washington, they said, had 400 troops, 300 that were actually able to fight. So we're now looking at 8 times that many, 2,400 people in this army that were being led by a British general named Edward Braddock. It says Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Dunbar lagged behind with 1,000 men in the Army's supplies. Braddock's goal of expelling the French from Fort Duquesne, where present-day Pittsburgh is located, was thwarted when his advanced troops collided with a force of French and Indians. Thwarted means it was kind of undone. It didn't work out. On July 14th, what remained of that once proud British army hobbled past this point, retreating from their disastrous defeat at the Battle of the Monongahela. Today, trails lead to this remnant of the Braddock Road, where a British army marched toward battle, returned in defeat, and buried its fallen leader. This painting shows British Major General Edward Braddock, back here on the horse, receiving a mortal wound during the Battle of the Monongahela on July 9th, 1755, as painted by Edwin Deming. So this painting shows the wounding of General Braddock. This is, I believe, Colonel Washington in the background here as well with the general. So a mortal wound is a wound that doesn't kill necessarily immediately. It could, but in this case, General Braddock was wounded, and later the wound would result in him losing his life after a few days. A secret grave. Major General Edward Braddock, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, traveled over the road traced below on June 25th, 1755. Marching north with his 2,400-man army, so this is a little repetitive from what we read a minute ago, the 60-year-old Braddock was under orders to capture Fort Duquesne and force the French from the upper Ohio Valley. However, disaster struck a few miles from Fort Duquesne on July 9th. There they collided with about 200 French and 600 Indians. So a force of 800 versus a force of really 1,400. There were 1,000 men, remember, that were lagging behind with supplies. Disorganization and fear seized the British as they suffered about 900 casualties. So the French and the Indian forces inflicted more casualties than they had troops. They had 800 soldiers or 800 fighters. There were 900 casualties on the British side. That was over half of what they had. And out of that 900, over half of those were killed out of the 1,400 engaged. Braddock himself was among those casualties, and he was mortally wounded. On July 13th, the British camped near here. Near here is near Fort Necessity. and Braddock died that night. He was buried under the road in an unmarked grave to keep it from being disturbed by Indians. So what the Native Americans would do, one of the things that would kind of show their pride in their victory was that they would take souvenirs. So if they could take things that belonged to this well-known general, the leader of the colonial forces in America, or the British forces in America, that would have been a pretty important thing for them. So they didn't want that to happen. They didn't want his body being disturbed after he was killed. So they buried him in an unmarked grave under the road. They marched over top of the road and marched over top of the grave to disguise it. So nobody knew where Braddock had been buried. In 1804, workmen repairing this section of the Braddock Road as they were getting ready to build the National Road, discovered what is believed to be Braddock's original grave site just downhill to the left. His remains were then reinterred on this hill, and the granite monument was added in 1913 to mark the grave, and we'll see that here in just a moment. The French, and I believe it says 1755, just like this sign, it says bloody defeat. At Fort Duquesne, Captain Claude Pierre Contrecoeur, I don't know if I'm saying that quite right, sends out a party of almost 800 Indian and French colonial soldiers to intercept Braddock's advance guard. That afternoon, the two sides collide, igniting a bloody forest battle. Among the casualties is General Braddock, who dies from his wounds 4 days later. Burying Braddock, July 14th, 1755. After a brief ceremony, George Washington and a few other soldiers bury Braddock in the middle of the road in an unmarked grave on their retreat. Then they march over it to remove any traces of it and return to Fort Cumberland. The British will not return to the Ohio country for almost 3 years. So they have not been able to recapture Fort Duquesne. It's going to be 3 years until they can come back and actually succeed in that mission. General Braddock was very much looked up to by George Washington. George Washington thought, here is the perfect British general. This is what I aspire to be. This is the kind of leader I want to be. So seeing all of that and seeing him shot and killed right in front of him certainly would have had an effect on George Washington as a young man. Braddock Park. General Edward Braddock was buried here in 1755 after his disastrous defeat and death. The site of his original grave, the new grave to which his remains were moved in 1804, and a trace of the Braddock Road may be seen here. Now, this is important, even though a lot of this information is repeated. This kind of sign, this is a Pennsylvania state historical marker. You'll see these all over. Make sure you look for them, and if you have a chance to stop and read them, do it. It tells you something neat that happened in that spot at some point in our past, at some point in history. So I always enjoy finding those, seeing those signs. There are quite a few right here in Blair County, and really neat little stories sometimes that a lot of people don't maybe know about. So it's neat to know the history of your area. At least it is to me, and I hope it is to you. So I hope when you're out driving, if you see one of those signs, there's a safe way to pull over and read it, that maybe you can ask your parents to do that and check those out, because they tell the story of what happened in our area, and it's really kind of cool to check out. And other states do something similar. I know I've seen signs like this in Maryland. I've seen signs like this in Virginia as well. So, but especially locally here, they're kind of neat to see. So it says here, this tablet marks the spot where Major General Edward Braddock was buried, July 14th, 1755, excuse me. His remains were removed in 1804 to the site of the present monument. So you can see there where he was buried, and just very plain, this border was added later. So it would have blended right in with the forest floor there. And then when they discovered that gravesite in 1804, they moved him to this location. It says this monument was erected and dedicated to the memory of Major General Edward Braddock by the Braddock Memorial Park Association of Fayette County, Pennsylvania, October 15th, 1913. So it was built many, many years later is when they actually built the monument. It also reads, here lieth the remains of Major General Edward Braddock, who in command of the 44th and 48th Regiments of English Regulars was mortally wounded in an engagement with the French and Indians under the command of Captain M. D. Beaujeu, at the Battle of the Monongahela, within 10 miles of Fort Duquesne. Now Pittsburgh, July 9th, 1755. He was borne back with the retreating army, borne back means carried back, to the old orchard camp about 1/4 of a mile west of this park, where he died July 13th, 1755. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington read the burial service at the grave. And there's a close-up of that monument as well. The road to revolution. This kind of goes back to what I said yesterday about cause and effect, and this how the small skirmish at Jumonville Glen led to larger things down the road. The aftermath of the French and Indian War set in motion a series of events that led to America's Revolutionary War. By the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, the American colonists unquestionably considered themselves to be loyal subjects of the British Crown. After all, they had fought, bled, and died alongside them in order to sweep the French out of North America. But that feeling of partnership and loyalty slowly began to dissolve as Great Britain started taxing the colonies in order to help pay for its swollen new empire. During the 1760s, disillusionment among the colonists grew. By the 1770s, it turned into fear, suspicion, rebellion, and finally, war. In 1783, the Revolutionary War ended. The Americans, led by George Washington, defeated the British and gained control of new territories, extending from the Alleghenies west to the Mississippi River and from Canada south to Florida. The young United States government would face many challenges, including finding ways to build roads that would tie the new nation together. And so during that Revolutionary War, also, one of our biggest allies, one of our best friends in fighting that war was the French. So we sided with the French. So the colonists went from fighting against the French alongside the British to fighting against the British alongside the French, which is pretty amazing when you think about it over the span of just a few years, 22 years, not that long in the greater scheme of things. George Washington later, I believe, wrote, "I did not let the anniversary of the Fort Necessity battle pass without a grateful remembrance of our escape. The same Providence that protected us will, I hope, continue his mercies and make us happy instruments in restoring peace and liberty." And that was, I believe, written during the Revolutionary War. So believing the 4th of July, 3rd of July, right as the Declaration of Independence was being written and signed, Washington was well aware that that was near the anniversary of the date that he had fought in that battle, his first major battle. Almost 30 years after he first faced combat at Fort Necessity, George Washington returned to this site. So that would have been 1784 or around there, so after the Revolutionary War had ended. His experiences here and in the French and Indian War defined his life. Washington often revisited his own memories about what took place at Fort Necessity. So that's where we'll wrap up with that closing photo of George Washington. Hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more, going a little bit more in depth to this battle at Fort Necessity and into the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania. We are going to continue next time by watching a video about the French and Indian War that is called The War That Made America. So we often think the war that made America was the Revolutionary War, and it certainly was. But like we said, cause and effect. These events started in motion with the French and Indian War. So that'll help bring things to life even more. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. I'll see you next time.